Genesis account that we have two different creation accounts. We have one that gives us the statements that the creation is going to take place, and then a description that it has. There's an excellent discussion of this in the material that we have in the sword, where we have the introductory word, God said, and then the executive word, or the creative word, where he executes this, let there be. It was so. Then the descriptive word of accomplishment, God made such and such, whatever it happens to be. And then a descriptive word of naming, God called it. Then an evaluation of that, God saw that it was good. And then a concluding statement that is generally temporal. It was morning, it was evening, or it was evening and morning, and it's day. Now you find that in the first creation account that is the way that each day progresses. In the second account, which begins in Genesis 2:4, that is more in story form. It is not a series of statements, but it describes the way in which God is working with the same type of method that we would use as human beings. This is anthropomorphic in the sense that God formed man, He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and so we are attributing to God those same attributes that we have as human beings. So we have really two different types of literature in that early material. One, a series of commands, and then the second, a story form. The first 5 Toledot, the stories, the history, are part of the primeval prologue. That is from chapter 2:4 up to chapter 11. So the first 5 are included in that section. Then there are 5 more that occur from Genesis 12 through Genesis 50. We have some genealogies that are given to us, very carefully constructed to move us from one person to another. Sometimes it's doubtful whether the genealogy is really giving us family information as much as political or ethnical or not ethnical. Yes, it is too, ethnical. It's the personal relationships of one person to another, just so that we can see where they start and where we now are. Oftentimes there are people left out in genealogies, but enough is given so that we know that this person is historically connected to that line. And so the genealogies are very artfully constructed for that purpose. Chapter 10, which gives us the Table of Nations, is an ethno-geographical list, not so much concerned with the relationships of Ham, Shem, and Japheth to their father Noah, but telling us where the political spheres of influence are at that time. There's a literary device that is also used in the names. Adam, the first man, also means mankind. Eve means life, or she who gives life. Cain is a forger. a forger of metals. And Enoch, the seventh from Adam, the one who is translated, says that Enoch walked with God and was not because God took him. His name basically means dedication or consecration. But when you have such items like this, it's obvious they're using a literary device to present theological truths. Yes?
I think also that
Adon means red, which, no. Edom and Adon are both red. They do have the same consonants. So, it would be easy to make that carry over from Adam or mankind to red. Mm-hmm. The authors of the Old Testament seem to draw on the literary formats of the ancient Near East in much of what they present.
You're saying that the name meaning specific things tell us that it's more literary than actual. Since it was that young anyhow, could they have gotten the meaning of those words from those names?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So it would have worked the other way.
Then from the persons you get the concept. Yes, they could be worked that way. We have some other names that work this same way. There is no parallel in other literatures to the paradise story. That is the fall in that sense. There is parallel to the creation account. We have parallels to the flood account. We do have one account that tells how mankind lost the hope of immortality, where a human being was offered the food of immortality, but he had been warned by one of the gods that if he was offered anything, he shouldn't take it. And so he refused it, and so he lost immortality. It was an unfortunate situation because the God who first gave him the advice wasn't aware of what the other gods were going to do to actually offer him eternal life. But that's not what we really have in the account in the Garden of Eden. Now, there is a passage in that garden which says that there had not been any rain up to that time, but what was it that watered the garden?
Mist.
In chapter 2 and verse 6, NIV translates that, but streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. In the King James, you have a mist. Well, they guessed at the word because they didn't know what it was. And the word in Hebrew is edu, or in its original form, in Sumerian, which means an underground water source. And what the Hebrew is doing is borrowing the word from the Sumerian, and it means a stream that which bubbles up. Also, we have the Garden of Eden, which comes from a Sumerian word, adinu, which means a plain. So the Garden of Eden is the plain, probably, of Shinar, which is the area around Saddam Hussein's territory today. See, those who are living in Iraq are living in the Garden of Eden. You probably think they're in paradise. But there we have a couple of indications that the authors are using words that are well known in the ancient East, And sometimes we have failed to translate them correctly because at that time these were unknown. So most of the materials that we have that help us in understanding these cultural things were not known before 1850, when they began hunting for artifacts to fill the museums. And then real archaeology began to take place around the turn of the century. So that's relatively new, less than 100 years for the field of archaeology, but we have gained a lot of knowledge about these ancient languages through that. And part of it is the Sumerian text, which now can be read, and the Akkadian texts, and several other bodies of literature that can now be read, and so we know what some of these things mean. We also have a story of a Tower of Babel in chapter 11. This is a play on words. We're told that these people were making a structure of some kind. This is probably a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a temple tower. And it's made in the form of a stepped pyramid. And we find these all over the area of Mesopotamia, where often they'll have a little chapel up at the top where the god is worshipped. And the idea behind all this is not that these people are trying to build a ladder to get to heaven. No concept of that at all. They're trying to make a monument, a name for themselves. They have been told that they are to scatter and people the whole earth, and they don't want to do that. They want to stay together. And so God goes down, and again an anthropological concept of God descending, and He confuses the language so they cannot communicate anymore. So the tower is called Babel, because God confused the language. The verb in Hebrew to confuse is balal, which sounds quite a bit like babal. And so they have taken the two and put them together. Now, Babel does not mean confusion at all. It comes from the Akkadian word, babu, and then you put it into a construct form in Hebrew and you lose that. And El, which is God. It's the gate of God. So if they're building a structure that is going to put them into relationship with God, they can call it the gate of God. And the city of Babylon is basically that. It's the gate to God. But since the language is confused and Babal sounds quite a bit like Babal, in English we now have Babel, which means confusion. Yeah. So you have a turn in the language. Genesis 1 through 11 has some very clear theological truths that we should not overlook. These truths are presented in symbolic, literary genre, and they tell us about the events where God has relationships with mankind. We have parallels with quite a bit of the material in Genesis 1 through 11 from literature and other nations. What distinguishes Genesis 1 through 11 from these other parallel materials is more important than what similarities are found. We can see in the flood story a person building a boat, a flood coming, that person being saved through that flood, the offering of sacrifices. All of these are similar to the biblical account. What is the distinguishing feature that separates all of this?
One God.
One God. One God as opposed to many gods. If the Hebrews borrowed any of their material, they filtered it through their theological system so that you never had multiplicity of gods. It's always one God. And that is the basic difference in all of these stories. We have one supreme deity with the Hebrews, and in these other literatures you have many gods. In the story of the flood, when Utnapishtim, who is the equivalent to Noah, offers his sacrifice, the gods come down like flies on the sacrifice. Now that, you see, would be completely taboo for the Hebrews. Lasore points out that there are 4 themes that are woven into the account in these first 11 chapters. The first has to do with the Creator. God is the Creator of all things. He has created man, and He has created man in His own image. And that image includes dominion and the functional aspect of being able to make things, create things. Man can do some things that animals cannot do, and that would be part of the image of God. His ability to perform and his dominion that he has over the other creatures. A second theme is the seriousness of sin on God's part. When a person rebels against God, God deals with it. And we have several examples of this. We have Eve, who eats of the tree, and Adam. We have Cain, who kills his brother. We have Lamech, who kills an innocent man. And then we have the flood, and we have the tower. Now, all of those show how God intervenes and punishes for sin. So He takes sin seriously. The third theme is the way in which God's judgment meets the human need with reference to sin at each point. In the case of Eve, when she sinned, her penalty is that she now is going to have more pain in childbirth, and her desire will be for her husband. The sin is committed by the individual, and God approaches the individual at that point. Immediately taking care of the sin problem is what the Zohar means by this. It's God's judgment on human sin. It is a solution, usually, but it also is punishment immediately for that sin. Because you have man then who is going to have to work by the sweat of the brow. The earth is not going to produce what it needs. I'm not sure that I can fully, but it looks like perhaps a comment that my daughter made might be an explanation of this. She called us right after her first child was born. In fact, a couple of hours after he was born. And I asked her, would you do it again? She'd just gone through all of this pain in childbirth. And she said, oh yes, because she held the child. Mm-hmm. And all of that was forgotten because she was holding the child. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that's it. This desire for children that, of course, comes through the joining of the two, that is what is meant by this.
Okay. Did you also say, when you said God dealt with man with sin, were you saying at this time God was making man aware that the atonement for sin, or making him aware that once you sin, there's a consequence?
He's doing both. He immediately steps in at the point of the sin and deals with it. So that the person doesn't get by with it. Say we have Cain, kills his brother. God immediately confronts Cain and says, the blood of your brother is crying out to you. And then Cain immediately is punished for that. And we also have the serpent, who is punished immediately because of what he has done. So that God immediately acts. The flood, we could say, is also an immediate action. God sees the sin of mankind and knows that this can't go on, and immediately brings an end to them. In the Tower of Babel scene, where they begin to build this tower contrary to what God has wanted, God immediately steps in, and the punishment in this case is confusion, so they can no longer communicate. Yet there's a fourth theme that is closely connected to that, and that is the grace of God that occurs in each of these situations. When Adam and Eve ate and they are then punished, God shows grace and they do not die immediately. The death is postponed. They are clothed. In the case of Cain, even though he is thrust out from God's presence, God puts a mark on Cain to protect Cain. The people are killed in the flood, but right after the flood, God tells Noah, this isn't going to happen again, and seed time and harvest will continue. The natural order of things will continue. So he shows grace. But in the case of the Tower of Babel, no grace is evident. That's the one place where it does not occur. Yes.
I was going to ask you a question about Genesis 27, where it says man and female, he created them. Mm-hmm. Did you elaborate on that?
In the Genesis 1 account, the emphasis is upon the creation of man as a totality. And the statement is just made, he made the male and female. In other words, the pair are made. Just like in the case of the animals, you have both sexes that are created. In the second chapter, see, it's treated a little differently. You have man who's all by himself.
Right. So the first chapter is not saying that at the same time he made both of them.
No, it's just saying in the creation process, God created both the male and the female. Now, we did talk, didn't we, about that creation of Adam and Eve, the fact that the animals are distinct from Adam? When God has created all the animals, they are brought to Adam, and the text says that Adam named them. We often jump on that and say, well, this shows how intelligent Adam was. Well, yes, it does, but that's not the real purpose of this. As all of these animals are paraded before Adam, there is one conclusion, a startling conclusion. None of them are like him. So God says it's not good for that to happen, and so God makes a companion for Adam, one of his own kind. Now, if I didn't do this, I should have, because this is important. In the Hebrew, there is, let's see, it would be this way. This is a word in Hebrew which means help. We have it used when Samuel set up a rock, and he called it Ebenezer, the help of rock, the rock of help. Well, in Hebrew, this is the word that is used for Eve. And so from that, we have got this idea of help mate or help meet or something like that, a helper. In Ugaritic, there is another. And it so happens that these two fall together in Hebrew. In Ugaritic, this root means equal. And that looks like what is meant here. That when God created Eve, He is creating an equal to Adam. Not creating a helper for Adam. Now that fits in with the whole tone of what is going on. See, the animals are brought. There are none that are equal to Adam. And so God creates this new being from Adam. And Adam says, now this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So she is an equal to Adam. Oh, so that's not right. Yes, you see, there are two roots in Proto-Semitic. And one means to help, and the other means to equal. And when you put them into Hebrew, both of them go into this, because Hebrew does not have this sound. This is a tag. And what Hebrew uses is the Zion for that. Yes.
I've taken a course of systematic theology, right? In systematic theology, you have to be able to prove, when you make a statement like that, to prove it in other areas in the Bible. And from other areas of the Bible, it seems to indicate that it's just that, I don't really care whether a woman's equal. I'm talking about the Bible, the proper interpretation of the Bible. It proves that the woman was a helpmate in other areas of the Bible, not that she was equal. Nowhere in the Bible. I don't find any other place in the Bible to substantiate the equal part, but I can find to substantiate the helpmate part, throughout, especially in the Old Testament, and even in today, the land where those words came from. Women are the same; they are not equal in a sense. So I couldn't understand why we can bring it here in America and make it equal. When in the country where the language was made, even today, women are not equal.
But today, most of that country is Muslim.
Okay, let's go to Hebrew. I mean, even Jewish people. The Jewish people.
You mean Golda Meir?
The whole society.
He was the prime minister of Israel.
How many prime ministers were there?
Well, Ben Gurion was the second.
Was she the first one, I'm saying?
No, Ben Gurion was the first,
Okay.
but she was the second.
The second, and how many prime ministers?
Doesn't matter, it wasn't one.
But the times are changing. But let's not change it. Let's not change the Bible because times are changing.
You're going to have to take the text for what it says.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Not for you to read into it your own sociology.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And I'm saying in that particular text, within the context, she is equivalent to Adam. The whole tenor of this is not that he will have somebody to help him, but he will have somebody like him. So in that sense, she is an equal with him, far above any of the animals. That's all it's saying. Now you can get your subordination and any of these other things that you want, but then you finally come up to that pouring out of the Spirit, and it looks like it's going to be on men and women. Sorry, just a moment. For the creation of the likeness is, I think it's Etzel. It's not this. No. It's different. It's creating God's image. It's not the same word. Well, now that we have his attention. I thought you would probably appreciate that.
I understand. I'm going to give you the wrong name this
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you a question. In another class that I had, they said that it wasn't actually a rib, but it was a reed. And the human name was a reed. The Eve was taken from a reed, not a R-I-D. And I'm just wondering what your interpretation of that is.
The word is normally translated as rib.
Oh, really?
Yes. I know there have been some other theories. One that at first Adam was able to reproduce by himself, and that the womb was taken from Adam and it's used to produce Eve. But we don't have any. I think that the whole intent of the Scripture at this point is to show that there is dissimilarity between human beings and the rest of God's creation. That's the whole thing. And it wouldn't matter what part is used to do this. All you need, I guess, is a cell. At least some of those science fiction movies that I've seen, all you need is a cell to do this sort of thing. I'm trying to think what the word is there, but I can't recall. But I know it's usually translated just rib. And if you count the ribs that the male has and the female has, you'll find that they're the same. Don't try to do that.
So he probably just took a look at
There's also the symbolic interpretation that is given that he took the part that was closest to the heart of man, the romantic view of creation. Well, let's talk about patriarchal history. Pardon? Genesis 12 on. Here again we have Toledo, the history. This is the history of Abraham. This is the history of Terah. It begins with chapter 11, verse 27. This is the account of Terah. And we have a short genealogy that takes us from Terah to Abram. And then a comment that Haran became the father of Lot. There are three men mentioned here. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, if you want to press that, you can say first set of triplets. I wouldn't press it, by the way. Haran became the father of Lot, and he's mentioned because he is important in the story later on. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Now, both of those are mentioned because they're important in the story. Sarai, we'll have much said about her, and also later, Milcah is going to be mentioned because she had children, and those will be connected with Isaac and his descendants. Sarai was barren. She had no children. Now, that's an important theme. There are certain motifs that run throughout this Genesis material that we can also find in other documents from the ancient East. And one of them is the inability of the wife to have children. That is a very important motif. In the marriage contracts from the ancient East, often you had built into the contract that if the woman did not bear a child, she was obligated to provide a substitute for her husband who would bear children for her. It's the sort of thing that you see happening with Abram and Sarah, where Sarah is barren, and she finally suggests to Abraham that he have Hagar as a wife. That is the worst suggestion that was ever made. It has led to conflict for 3,000 years. And there's still conflict because of this. From Hagar comes Ishmael, and from Ishmael comes the Arabs. And on the other hand, you have Sarah, from her comes Isaac, and from him comes the Jews. And as a result, we have an eternal conflict. But the law at that time, or the custom, I should say, at that time, provided for the woman who was barren. There's also provision for those children, or for those couples who did not have children, to adopt a child. This seems to be Abram's situation when he mentions that Eliezer is going to inherit his property. And we have several tablets, many of these coming from the city of Nuzu, where a person adopts a younger person as his son. Then that adopted son has a responsibility of carrying out the burial of his adopted father and mother. When that has been completed, the property goes to him. So in turn for caring for the adopted parents, he received their property. Also, that type of adoption was misused. The law said that you could not sell property, so oftentimes they would get around the sale of property with a sale adoption. They would adopt a person as their son. That son would give them a certain sum of money, which would be the equivalent of the cost of property, and then he would get the property. So we have sale adoptions as well as true adoptions in some of this material. When we talk about the ancient East, there is a historical framework in which we must put the patriarchs, and there is a archaeological and historical outline that I'll give you, as most of the writing is based on this. I usually begin with Neolithic period. That's New Stone Age, where there is a transition that is made in society from a gathering community to a producing community, where you no longer roam in order to find grains, but you begin to sow grains. You no longer roam in order to find animals, but you begin to raise your animals. And that change from gathering to producing is called the Neolithic Revolution, and that takes place anywhere from 8,000 to 4,000 BC. Now that is for the Middle East. These figures do not hold for other parts of the world. For instance, the history of Britain would be such that it's much more recent than that. Not as early as 4,000, but probably closer to 2,000 for this period of Britain and other parts. Chalcolithic is the next period, and that comes from lithic, which means stone, and chalco, which is mixed. It's a part metal, part stone period. And that's from 4,000 to 3,100 approximately. All these dates are approximate. It's impossible to say in the year 3,100 one aspect of civilization ceased and the other immediately started. It's a big transition, but these are approximate dates. And then we have early bronze, and that is from 3,100 to 2,200 or 2,250. Middle bronze, we can go to from 2,200 to 1,550. And late bronze, from 1,550 to 1,200. And then iron comes in at 1,200. And then depending on what system you're using, you can go down to the Persian period, which would be 538, or the destruction of Jerusalem, which is 586, 87. Usually they go to 586. And then you start naming all of these periods after countries. After the Iron Age, then you have the Persian period, which would take you, they really don't come in as early as 586 to 538, 539, to 332, and Alexander the Great comes along, and then you have the Greek period from 332 63 BC. What I would like to do is spend the rest of the semester talking about these periods, but we've got other materials to cover here. We have, of course, ancient Near East civilization that does that sort of thing, and this is where most of my interest is back in these periods. Anytime you get up here to the Greek period, you're talking about modern history, and I like ancient here. There's so much to be learned about what's going on in the world in this time, and they're constantly finding new materials. And if I could do anything I wanted to, what I would do is lock myself in my study with cuneiform tablets and just read. Probably wouldn't be very productive, but it's fun. And all that's back here in this period. Now the sword has a section where he discusses the historical background and the ancient Near East in the 3rd and the 2nd millennium, and that may be a little bit detailed for some of you. It tells the various peoples who were living at that time, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and the rest of them, and it also mentions the Egyptians. One of the easiest ways to keep the Egyptian history and this other history together is to think of the early Bronze period as the early or Old Kingdom period. You better call it Old Kingdom. Old Kingdom Egypt compares with the early Bronze Middle Kingdom Egypt with the Middle Bronze and Late Kingdom with Late Bronze. Now, there's not exact correlation, but close enough that you can fit them together that way. Both the Egyptian history and the Mesopotamian history has a lot to do with the Bible. This is part of the biblical world. Abraham went down to Egypt. Jacob and his children went to Egypt and lived in Egypt for a long period of time. We have a constant contact between Egyptians and Hebrews until the Greek period, so that these people are meeting one another and influencing one another. And so the more we know about these other cultures, the better the chance we have of understanding what is going on in the Old Testament. As recent as 1975, there were about 20,000 of these clay tablets found at a city called Ebla. This is in northern Syria. The names that appear in those tablets are very similar to names that occur in the Old Testament. In fact, the king of Ebla was called Eber, E-B-I-R. The great-grandfather of Abraham is called Eber. So you have evidence that the names that are used in the patriarchal period are very similar to names that were in common use about this same time elsewhere. Now, Ebla was destroyed just about 2200 BC. So that what is reflected here, see, is that early Bronze Middle Bronze period, and that's where we'd like to put the patriarchs in that period. There are several reasons for dating the patriarchs to that period, and this comes in the chapter on the date and historicity of the patriarchal narratives. There's quite a debate that goes on where to put these patriarchs. There are some scholars, and have been some scholars, that refuse to put them anywhere, saying that they're not real people. These are fictitious characters that were made up to create a history of Israel. The history of Israel by Martin Note begins with David. We can't know anything about what happened earlier than that. Because of the finds in the last half a century, it's obvious that the materials that we have in the patriarchal narratives correctly portray events and cultures that were common to the ancient East at that time. So whoever wrote it did an excellent job of making it right. Remember Cyrus Gordon emphasizing that little children know the difference between what can be and cannot be in games that they play. If you're playing cowboys and Indians, you do not have airplanes. You have horses, you have bows and arrows, and you have guns. But you do not come in with a helicopter. That's out. And children who are playing cowboys and Indians would immediately call foul if you brought a helicopter into their play. The same thing is true when we talk about the patriarchal narratives. If you bring something in that does not fit, that is an anachronism, it will immediately be challenged. And there is nothing in the patriarchal narratives that can be challenged on the basis of what we know went on in that Middle Bronze period. Very accurate. And the more information that we gather, the more we are sure that what is said here is faithful to the culture.
I was wondering if Melchizedek could be part of the patriarch period. And then when we look at Hebrews 7, we see where Melchizedek is the priest and Abraham, coming back from one of his wars, did meet with him and gave him part of his war. So I was wondering, say, if you were naming those two periods here, could he possibly be in there because as a leader, someone to look up that was honored by God and giving homage to him from the victories of his war?
If Abraham had contact with him, then he would have to be in the patriarchal period. And I would take at face value whatever I read in the text until somebody can prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that it's wrong. And I don't think so far anybody has been able to prove this. Take, for instance, we have in these early chapters of the Bible the mention of the inhabitants of Canaan. We have a group of people called Hittites. Abraham bought a field from the Hittites. You look in one of the old encyclopedias under Hittites, and what you will find is a small tribe living in Palestine during the time of Abraham. Now, was that the Hittite? Certainly not. We know now, because of the materials that have been discovered in Turkey and the capital city of Bogoskoy, that the Hittites were an empire in the 14th, 13th centuries BC, They ruled over all of Turkey and all of the territory from Babylon through Canaan. So when the Bible mentioned Hittites, it's talking about real people, real Hittites, and it was an empire. Same thing is true of the Horites that are mentioned. These are probably Hurrians. They were the ones that dominated the Middle East before the time of the Hittites. And you have them all over the place. Huge kingdom called Mitanni. Hanigalbar. These places are all part of the empire of the Hurrians. Now the Bible mentions them in passing. And there have been some Bible critics, not recently, but some critics in past years who said that these were merely fabrications that were made up by the authors of the Old Testament. But every one of them has proved to be true. Yes. There were a number in Canaan that they drove out. Most of those they drive out are smaller groups. The Girgashites and the Amorites would be a much larger group. It would be those living in yes. The names of the patriarchs fit best into this period of the Middle Bronze period. We know this from the materials that we have found at Mari, at Ebla, at Nuzu, and Babylon. The names fit. In Mari there is the mention of a tribe called Benjamin. In that case it probably means people who live in the south, since Benjamin is son of the south, so a southerner. And later it's applied to one of the tribes of Israel. The style of travel of Abraham fits into this period. Abraham is nomadic. He wanders from place to place, coming into contact with settled communities, oftentimes doing business with settled communities, but moving back and forth. He is now called a merchant prince. That seems to be what he was when he is addressed by the Hittites when he's buying the field of Machpelah. They call him a prince. He also has enough money that he can pay cash for that field, 400 shekels or so. So he is a very wealthy person, not only in the metals that he has, but also in his sheep and camels.
You said earlier that they weren't allowed to sell property when you were talking about the adoption. Is this a different period of time that they're allowed to?
Yes, this is different in the case of the Hittites. Hittites could. When the Israelites come into Canaan, they are not to sell property because the property doesn't belong to them. The property belongs to God. It has been allotted to the tribes. It's their tribal allotment, but they can't sell it because it's really not theirs.
So that wasn't international, that was only national?
Locally, yes, locally. Talking with Gideon, who was visiting us from Nigeria, taking him up to the bus terminal last night. And along Riverside, I had mentioned to him that they were originally going to put that in as a throughway. And they'd removed several of the homes below 61st Street to widen Riverside Drive. And then I guess they've given up on the plan. They haven't done anything for years. So he says, well, what happens to those people who are living there? Well, they just condemn the property, and then they have to move elsewhere. And he says, you mean they own the property? He says in Nigeria, the state owns all the property. You don't have private ownership. And if you want to sell your home, then you have to get permission from the government to sell it, because it's on land that belongs to the government. So you have all kinds of different ways of doing things. The social and legal customs that occur in the patriarchal narratives can be compared with a wide range of socio-juridical customs from both the second and the first millennia BC. Nuzu gives us a lot of parallels to this. The city, N-U-Z-U. And if you want the last word on the subject, you can look up my dissertation called Court Procedure at Nuzu. If we still have it in the library. It used to be in the law library. And I don't know if they shipped it out to the east or not. Possible seed. Yeah, seed. I doubt that it's growing. And we also need to talk about the religions of the patriarchs, but since we are just about out of time, I think I will leave that and come back and discuss that as a unit. Just one comment about history. Anson Rainey, who's a professor at Tel Aviv University, has made the comment that when we look at history, it is more important what people think happened than what actually happened. And if you think about that, you see how true that is. What people think happened is more important than what actually happened. We've had a lot of injustices done because of what people think happened rather than what actually did happen. And our understanding of an event is more important sometimes than the event itself. And that's what we see also in the biblical material. What these writers think happened is more important than what actually happened.
Yeah, a little bit.
So short, actually, the spiritual encounter that I really believe is so helpful for studying the New Testament that I just like to read it because this is also wisdom, the book of wisdom written by the Prince of Solomon. In his honor, we receive also the Apocalypse of John. There is the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, and that of Peter. Now, some amongst us will not have this letter read in the church. There were those that did not accept Peter into the gospel, into the canon at this time. And I think that what we're seeing here is probably a reference to the epistles of Peter, instead of the Apocalypse, and others have accepted this as well. The pastor cannot be 100% sure. The pastor, moreover, did Hermas write very recently in our times in the city of Rome, while his brother, Bishop Pius, sat at the chair of the Church of Rome. But therefore, it also ought to be read that it cannot be made public in the church to the people, nor placed among the prophets, as their number is complete, nor among the apostles to the end time. On the writings of Aristoteles, also called also Valentinus, or
no deities, we see nothing at all. Valentine Gnosticism is an area of study in itself. A very Gnostic in its orientation that, of course, toward Paul. Those are rejected too, who wrote the New Book of Songs to Marcion, together with Basilides and the founder of Asian Cataphrenes. When we look at this whole document, we can see that only Hebrews, James, and one epistle of John are absent. That is, if we accept this reference to Peter as being implicit. Only Hebrews, James, and one epistle of John are absent. What we do find, and I think is quite interesting and of great significance in the study of the New Testament, to summarize briefly what we're seeing in the European canon. Obviously, there is a rejection of Marcionism. There is a recognition of the Old Testament. They are accepting documents for use in the community for faith and practice. This is a very early formative period of early Christianity. And what's so important, I think, for us in the church today is that we need our Bible. And they can distinguish between books that were not to be included in the Bible. Sometimes when we talk about canon, people say, I'm afraid something might have slipped by that should have been in. They were very careful and meticulous, the church and the community. And if there was something in question, they preferred to leave it out instead of having an inflationary approach to inspiration and adding more documents. Now, there were some documents that were said that could be read for the profit of the church. Shepherd Hermas, the church fathers. You can learn a lot from reading these documents. They have a spiritual content, but they are not to be read and placed on the same authority as the prophets and the Gospels. And he makes a sharp division between let's not mix God with drink. There are the springs of life, as Bishop Athanasius said, that we should drink from for salvation. When we look at the church today, I emphasize, we need our Bible. I got one question, and then I'll hold you over. Just a minute.
You want information about Dr. Lindsay being here?
Yeah, but let's get a comment. Yes.
There are several that are teaching. There was a third member of Corinthians, as he's gone through the canon and decided that I've never seen any real doctrine of the third member of Corinthians, even though it could be alluded to as a deep study. What do you think about that?
Oh, it depends. We'll talk about that when we look at Corinthians. It kind of depends on if you think Paul wrote epistles or postcards. Scott Salter pointed out Dr. Lindsay, very good friend, will be speaking Thursday night at Ken Lenore Mulligan's house. She teaches Hebrew and undergraduate. She's lived in Israel for 50 years. Very good friend of mine. She'd like to learn Intelligence.